They set off again, the class looking at a shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. He led them down a second corridor, stopped right outside the staff room door. Inside, please, said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long paneled room full of odd, old mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair, and he looked around as if the class filed in. His eyes were glittering, and there was a nasty sneer playing around his mouth. As Professor Lupin came in and close the door behind him, Snape said, "Leave it open, Lupin. I'd rather not witness this." He got up onto his feet and strode past the class, his black robes billowing behind him. At the doorway, he turned on his heel. "Possibly no one's warned you, Lupin, but the class contains Neville Longbottom. I would advise you not to entrust him with anything difficult, not unless Hermione Granger is hissing instructions in his ear." Neville went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Neville in his own class, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Professor Lupin raised his eyebrows. "I was hoping that Neville would assist me with the first stage of the operation," he said, "and I'm sure he will perform it admirably." Neville's face went, if possible, even redder. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class towards the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe. This is where the teachers kept their spare robes, and Professor Lupin went to stand next to it. The wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin, calmly, because a few people had jumped backwards in alarm. "There's a Bogart in there." Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about. Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Bogarts like dark enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes like gaps beneath beds and cupboards and under sinks. I once met one lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, when I was asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it and give it me to the third years for some practice. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a Bogart?" Hermione put her hand up. "It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever you think you're frightened of the most." "Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin. And Hermione glowed. "So the Bogart, sitting in the darkness within, has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten him. The person on the other side of the door, nobody knows what the Bogart looks like when he's alone. But when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us is of our most fears. This means," Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small sputter of terror, "that we have to have a huge advantage over the Bogart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry?" Trying to answer the question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of his feet with her hand in the air. Was very off-putting, but Harry had to go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it will be." "Precisely," says Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking quite disappointed, a little disappointed. "It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a Bogart. He becomes confused. Which should he become? The headless corpse? The flesh-eating slug? I once saw Bogart make a very mistake and try to frighten two people at once by turning himself into half a slug, not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a Bogart is simple, yet requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes the Bogart off is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. And we will practice this charm without our wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous. Ridiculous, said the class together. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good. But that was easy, Pot. I'm afraid you see the word not alone is enough. And this is where you come in, Neville. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Neville, who walked forward, as though he were heading for the gallows. Right, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you the most in the world? Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. Didn't catch that, Neville, sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly, as though begging someone for help. And then, more precisely, the whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically at Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Oh, Professor Snape. Neville. I believe you live with your grandmother. Yes, said Neville nervously. But I don't want the Bogart to turn into her either. No, no, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder, could you tell us the sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled. But, he said, well, she always has some kind of hat, a tall one with stuffed vulture or something on top, and a long dress, green normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag, prompted Professor Lupin. Oh, a big red one, said Neville. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you picture them in your mind's eye? Yes, said Neville, uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. When the Bogart bursts out of the wardrobe, Neville, when he sees you, it'll assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand and thus cry out, Ridiculous! And concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Bogart Snape will be forced into that vulture-topped hat and the green dress with your big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter. The wardrobe wobbled violently. If Neville was unsuccessful, the Bogart is likely to shift in his attention to each of us in turn, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you the most, and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him the most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. Voldemort returned to full strength, but before he even started to plan a possible attack, the Bogart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand slithering back beneath a black cloak, a long, rattled breath from the unseen mouth, then the cold penetrating. It felt like drowning. Harry shivered and looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, Take his legs off. Harry was sure he knew what Ron was thinking about. His greatest fear was spiders. Everyone ready? Said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear. He wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. Neville, we're going to back away, said Professor Lupin. Let you have your clear field, all right? I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now so Neville can get a good clear shot. They all retreated back against the wall, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale, frightened, but he had pushed up his sleeves and his robes and was holding his wand at the ready. On the count of 3, Neville, said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, now. A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin, hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his worn mouth wordlessly. Snape was bearing down on him. Reaching inside his robes, he said, Ridiculous! Squeaked Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long lace-embroidered dress and towering top hat with a moth-eaten vulture, and he was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter, and the Bogart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati, forward!" Parvati walked up forward, her face. Snape rounded on her, and another crack, and he had stood there was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turned to Parvati, and she began to walk towards her very slowly, dragging its feet, its arms riding. "Ridiculous!" cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled the mummy's feet, and he became tangled and fell face forward, and his head rolled off. "Seamus!" roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Parvati. Crack! The mummy had been a woman with floor-length hair and skeletal green tinged face, a banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and uncertainly sound filled the room, and wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. "Ridiculous!" screamed Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail and circled, and then crack! Became a rattlesnake and slithered before. Crack! "It's confused," shouted Lupin. "We're getting there, Dean!" Dean hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball came and severed the hand, which flipped over and began to creeping along the floor like a crab. "Ridiculous!" yelled Dean. There was a snap, and it trapped in the mouse trap. "Excellent! Ron, you're next!" Ron leaped forward. Crack! Quite a few people screamed, and a giant spider, 6 feet tall, covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pinches menacingly. For a moment, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, "Ridiculous!" bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished, and it rolled over and over. Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way as it became to halt at Harry's feet. It raised his wand repeatedly. "Here!" shouted Professor Lupin. "Hurry forward!" Crack! The legless spider had vanished. For a second, everyone looked wildly around to see where it was, and then they saw it, the silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, "Ridiculous!" almost lazily. Crack! "Forward! Neville, finish him off!" And Lupin, as the Bogart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack! Snapped. Snape was back. This time Neville charged forward, looking determined. "Ridiculous!" he shouted. They had split-second view of Snape in a lacy dress before Neville let out the ha of laughter, and the Bogart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and it was gone. "Excellent!" cried Professor Lupin. The class broke into applause. "Excellent, Neville. Well done, everyone. Let me see. 5 points to Gryffindor for every person to tackle a Bogart. 10 for Neville because he did it twice. And 5 each to Hermione and Harry." "But I didn't do anything," said Harry. "You and Hermione answered my question correctly at the start of the class, Harry," Lupin said lightly. "Very well. Off, everyone. Excellent lesson. Homework. Kindly read the chapter on Bogarts and summarize it for me. It should be handed in on Monday. That will be all." Talking excitedly, the class left the staff room. Harry, however, wasn't feeling cheerful. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped him from tackling the Bogart. Why? Was it because he'd seen Harry collapse on the train and thought he wasn't up to much? Had he thought Harry would pass out again? No one else seemed to have noticed anything. "Did you see me take that banshee?" shouted Seamus. "And the hand," said Dean, waving his own wand around. "And Snape in the hat. And my mummy." "I wonder why Professor Lupin's frightened of a crystal ball," said Lavender thoughtfully. "That was the best defense against art lessons we've ever had, wasn't it?" Ron said excitedly, as they made their way back to the classroom to get their bag. "He seems like a very good teacher," Hermione said approvingly. "But I wish I would have had a turn at the Bogart." "What would it have been for you?" Ron asked, sniggering. "A piece of homework that only got 9 out of 10?